in Cuba and around the world, because Cuba has responded to the crisis on a global level and dispatched healthcare professionals to Jamaica, to Italy, and other places as well. So that's the purpose of this conversation, Professor August Nimtz, to get a sense of what's happening with Cuba and in the African diaspora, and how our people are demonstrating both resilience and a clear path to a future in which we win at the end of the day.
No, you're absolutely right, Al. This is a real tragedy on a global scale, and there's so many places in the world that we're not hearing about. I was just talking yesterday with a colleague from India, and who described a very, very horrible situation that's going on there. Unfortunately, we're not hearing about it. I suspect right next door in Mexico, we see the same kind of horrors playing out. In many ways, so that's what makes Cuba, in my opinion, unique. Cuba is the exception with regard to this horror. And what this horror reveals is the kinds of choices a society has made before, previous choices, what its priorities are. And so we pay in human costs, deep human costs, for all the kinds of decisions that have been made in the past. And as you said, in many ways, this is predictable as in terms of the disparities. Mm-hmm. As you may know, I'm from New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And so I personally had a taste of something like this with Hurricane Katrina, the floodwaters, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And what Katrina revealed, again, were all of the decisions that had been made in the past, all the priorities, the privileges and so on from the past, all of those came back to haunt us. Mm-hmm. And that's what the tragedy revealed. And so this time it's on a global basis, and it's especially tragic for the third world, the so-called third world underdeveloped countries. In Africa, where this thing is just beginning to break and beginning to take its toll. There will be untold human costs that come with this. A pandemic is a natural phenomenon. Whether or not it becomes a social phenomenon, a social tragedy, depends once again on the decisions that society has made in the past. And luckily, the people of Cuba did something in 1959, and that is to make a revolution. And they took power, and they brought into existence a political system and a government that serves the humans of Cuba, the people of Cuba. And not only in Cuba, what's so striking about Cuba is that what the Cubans did, it allows them to come to the aid of others in need. And that is perhaps singular anywhere in the world. And Cuba is a poor country, as you know, Al. Mm-hmm. It's a Caribbean poor country, saddled with all of the problems of underdevelopment from the past. But the Cubans share their limited resources with others who are in need. And that's been the reality since 1963, when it first sent medical missions and other kinds of missions abroad. So what the Cubans are doing, and which you summarized very nicely at the beginning, Al, is simply in a long tradition. And this is what the Cubans expect, and this is what others expect of the Cubans. In the face of, as you know, a blockade, a devastating blockade from the United States. The United States government does all it can to make it difficult for the Cubans to provide the kind of assistance that they are doing. That's another remarkable feature of the Cuban project. So yes, when I saw the images of the Cuban doctors, there were 140 of them getting off the plane in Jamaica and leaving the airport, I said, I got to talk to Brother Al about this. Al needs to see this.
And I did. I watched it as well. I watched it live on the internet and went back and viewed it several times. I'm impressed. My intent, my desire, Brother August, is to connect with some of those Cuban doctors in Jamaica and to connect with maybe the embassy here. We want to use this show, the Tuesday version of Conversations with Al McFarlane, to pivot towards a diaspora orientation, where we connect with our people, not only in this country, but in the Caribbean, in Cuba, in South America, our people on the continent and our people in Europe as well, and other places. We're everywhere, and we are contributing everywhere. We simply don't often know how similar our paths are and how we have consistently outlived and outperformed the predictions of our demise.
Yes.
We still rise, as they say. So,
You're
you
right.
know, I'm so glad. And then Cuba also sent doctors to Italy, other countries, and offered medical assistance to this country.
Yes.
What happened when Cuba offered the U.S. Expert medical support?
Well, same thing had happened in 2005 in the aftermath of Katrina. 1,600 Cubans were packed and ready to leave to come to New Orleans. And they didn't want to make a big deal out of it. They didn't announce it at all because they knew that Washington would think that this was some kind of maneuver on the part of the Cubans. So they kept it very quiet. But people kept asking. Friends of Cuba said, "Where are the Cubans? Where are the Cubans?" And so the Cubans had to reveal that, yes, we are prepared to go to New Orleans. And of course, the Bush administration turned down that offer. So we shouldn't be surprised if the Bush administration turned it down, that this current administration would turn down any kind of offer of aid on the part of the Cubans. There is some impact of the Cubans in the Bronx. Students who studied at the School of Medicine free of charge on the part of the Cuban government. Students from poor, impoverished areas such as the Bronx in New York are actually practicing medicine right now in New York, trying to help with the COVID crisis. So there is a little bit of a footprint, despite Washington's best efforts to keep the Cubans out. There is a little bit of the footprint of the Cuban Revolution playing itself right now in the Bronx, in New York.
We had hoped to have some colleagues of yours join us. They may join us still. I'm sure they're listening. Greg Clave and Franklin Corbello, and I think one other person was supposed to be on. They are listening and have a chance to connect with us on the program. We would love to have them, their voice, their perspectives. But we're glad that you and I can talk, August Nimtz. Thank you so much. I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane, broadcasting live from KFAI, doing this remotely using the technology of Zoom and Facebook and also YouTube to broaden, extend our audience, to use multiple platforms to connect, to engage. If you like this kind of programming, like us and share us on Facebook, subscribe to the Insight News page and the KFAI page on YouTube. We want you to be involved. Also, if you have a question or comment, you can send that in to Professor Nimtz and to me, and we'll try to share your comment as well. And so, August, talk about the work and the history of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee. You have been in the field for a while, trying to create awareness and consciousness, I believe, about the atrocity of the U.S. position towards the Cuban people and the evil, actually, I would say, that I think makes mockery of the principles of justice and democracy when it comes to these people. And why is that so?
Right. No, thanks for asking about the history of the committee, Al. Yeah, we've been around since 1990. In the aftermath of the Sandinistas election, in which they lost in 1990, I think it was February 1990, many of us who had been longtime supporters of the Cuban Revolution got together nationally and locally to defend the Cuban Revolution, because we knew that Washington was feeling its oats after the defeat of the Sandinistas in the 1990 elections. We knew that Cuba would be in the crosshairs once again. And so both nationally, with a march in New York City in April of 1990, and after that march, some of us came back to the Twin Cities and put out a call to organize a solidarity committee with Cuba. We met at Reverend Heron's Church in North Minneapolis. That's where the initial meeting took place. And out of that, the committee came in various names, but Minnesota-Cuba Committee is our most recent incarnation. And our main task is to challenge not only the material blockade embargo against the Cuban people, but perhaps more important, the information blockade. The last thing that Washington wants is for the American people, especially its working class component, to know about the reality of the Cuban Revolution. And so it makes it difficult for the US public to know about Cuba, making it difficult for people to travel there, to see Cuba with their own eyes, and that's crucial. One of our major goals is to challenge the travel blockade that makes it difficult for people to go to Cuba, to see it for themselves, and to make up their own minds. And one of the things that the travel blockade is designed to do is to do exactly that. That is to prevent people from knowing the reality of Cuba, and therefore Washington and its allies can say whatever it wants about the Cuban Revolution. So over the years, we've been bringing people to Cuba. We've been inviting Cubans to come here to speak to us, and so yeah, that's been our mission to challenge Washington's policies toward Cuba. And as you're right, they're criminal policies, and we think that these policies are not in the interests of the American people, but in fact, they undermine the interests of the American public. So you've been a longtime supporter and of our committee, and helped us to publicize the kinds of messages that we want to get out, and we appreciate your coming to our help once again.
Well, it's my pleasure, and it's both a duty and I think an honor to be associated with the vision and with the work. I fully endorse and support the work of the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, and I, like you, believe that we will all be better off when we can look get a true look, a better look, a real look, our own look at life on the ground. So let me ask you, Professor Nimtz, what is it that our government doesn't want Americans to know about life in Cuba? How would you characterize that? And I'm going to go somewhere with the question, because I think I want to lead from that to the question of what is it our government doesn't want you to know about the Black man killed in Georgia? Because I think those things are connected. And it's the fact that you found out about it through social media that's making a difference. Is there an equation here? Something that's similar? So that's take this conversation there.
Yeah, the main thing that Washington doesn't want you to see, working people, especially the working class of the United States, is to see that in Cuba, the working class is actually in power. And what I mean by that, the Cubans have a political system, a governance that actually serves the interests of the majority of the population for the first time. That's what came in 1959. Before 1959, the Cuban reality was one in which a minority of the population, in collaboration with Washington, actually ran Cuban society. And for the first time after 1959, it's the Cuban people who actually run the society. That's the great secret. That's the big secret about the Cuban Revolution, that Washington doesn't want workers, especially the working class in this country, to know about. And so from Washington's perspective, what the Cubans did is a bad example. It's a bad example for not only people in this country, but for people elsewhere in the world. You don't go to Cuba to see stuff, to find material goods. That's not what Cuba is about. Cuba is about changing the values of people, the value of what I call my interest as an individual. My advancement as an individual depends upon the advancement of others, especially the most oppressed in the world. That's the values of the Cuban Revolution, and so it's expressed exactly with the with the thousands of Cubans who are serving in other countries as we speak right now, in some of the most impoverished areas of the world. One of the most noble things, well, there are two strikingly noble things the Cubans did, and that was the defeat of the racist apartheid South African army in Angola in 1988, which paved the way to the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And one of the first places that Nelson Mandela visited after he came out of prison in 1990 and 1991 was to visit Cuba, to express his thanks to the Cuban people and to tell the Cuban people, if not what you did in Southern Angola in 1988, I would not be able to be here today speaking with you. And
explain
so,
more about what they did. What was their role? What was the
yes,
Cuban role in Angola?
Yes.
How that impacted South Africa and their move towards the end of apartheid?
Right. Basically, what the Cubans did was to defeat the South African army
On the battleground.
on the battleground,
Okay.
on the battlefield. And in 1988, in a small town called Quito Cuanavale in southern Angola. And with that defeat, it forced South Africa to leave Angola. It was illegally occupying parts of Angola. And with that defeat, South Africa was forced to retreat to its own borders, and that paved the way for the freedom liberation of Namibia, which is the country that's south of Angola. And as Fidel Castro confidently predicted at a press conference in June of 1988, he said, with this victory, the apartheid system in South Africa will soon come to an end. And that's exactly what happened. It forced the regime to the negotiating table to sit and talk with Mandela and others of the liberation movement. And that paved the way for the first free elections in South Africa's history in 1994 and 1995. So that's what the Cubans were able to do. Over 300,000 Cubans went to Angola. More than 2,000 Cubans lost their lives in that fight. And in South Africa, there's a monument, along with others, dedicated to what the Cubans did in Angola. Fast forward to what I think is perhaps the next most noble thing the Cubans did, and that was in 2014. And that's when the World Health Organization came to Cuba because of its long record of coming to the aid of others. The World Health Organization asked the Cubans, would they send medical personnel to West Africa to help with the Ebola scourge? Mm-hmm. And the Cubans said, yes, we will. And so what the Cubans did, they put out a call to their population for volunteers. These are always volunteer actions. Mm-hmm. And 12,000 Cubans volunteered to go to West Africa. And out of that 12,000, they selected and trained 256 of them to go to West Africa. It's the only country in the world, let me repeat that, it's the only country in the world that sent medical personnel to help with the scourge that was taking place. Yeah, there were some organizations such as Doctors Without Borders, but in terms of countries and governments that actually sent medical personnel, Cuba was the only country to do so. There was no other country in Africa, no other country in the Caribbean who wanted to do so. And this came with great risk, as you know. Mm-hmm. The Cubans had to be trained and selected when they came back to Cuba, that the population in Cuba itself could feel safe.
Right.
And that was extremely important. And it's another way of measuring the Cuban Revolution and its significance, because that reflects the deep trust, mm-hmm. the deep trust on the part of the Cuban people in their government, that they would be able to do something like this, send 256 people to West Africa with the possibility that some people would become infected. In fact, one was, mm-hmm. and he had to be medevaced to Switzerland, where he recovered, and he went back. Mm. He went back to continue to work in West Africa. So the three countries of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. Those were the three countries where the Cuban doctors went to. And that was the fact is that there were already Cuban doctors there because of the long history of Cubans doing work in Africa. At least 34 countries, 32 or 34 countries in Africa where Cubans have doctors. So there is some discussion, by the way, because of what the Cubans are doing right now. I don't know the details, and I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't happen, but Cuba has been nominated for a Nobel Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, by people who have long appreciated what the Cubans have done. I'm sure Washington will do all it can to make sure that Cuba will not get a Nobel Peace Prize. So we're not holding our breaths that this will actually happen, but it's an expression of the deep appreciation that people from around the world have about what the Cubans are doing. So
I'm
yes.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. My guest is Professor August Nimtz, here representing the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, a dear friend, respected scholar, elder, leader, revolutionary person who has been committed to change and at whatever the cost, I believe, change that cannot be stopped. So thank you for being here, Professor Nimtz. You know, you mentioned that our government considered Cuba to be a bad example. And when you say bad example, what pops into my mind immediately is how this country in Europe saw Haiti as a bad example as well. So the Haitians, with General Toussaint Louverture and others, mounted a successful revolt that defeated the French army and overthrew that colonial yoke. But the consequence long run has been something just like Cuba has experienced, and that is an international blockade or boycott, an international commitment to hold Haiti out as a bad example. And what was once called the breadbasket of Europe turned it into a fallow wasteland, right? Something that is scorched, useless, and its people subsistence living with no hope, sort of divided by class, artificial classes created by the colonial masters, right? And the imperial masters. So Cuba has to sort of come through that history and demonstrate another outcome. I think it's trying to, but one has to question the economics and the relative economic instability, or what's perceived to be, and I could be wrong, the economic lack in the Cuban population. And that's presented as evidence of the failure of the system. But is that really true? Right. And how does Cuba cope with that? How do you cope with that in terms of having this discussion?
Well, I really appreciate what you said about Haiti, the Haitian parallel, because it has all kinds of lessons for us. Fidel Castro said when he was in prison in 1954, 1955, one of his inspirations was Toussaint Louverture. The example of Toussaint Louverture from Haiti was an inspiration for him and others from his movement once they got out of prison, to be able to repeat and to do what the Haitians were able accomplished. You're right. Haiti was penalized, and that's exactly what Washington has sought to do after 1959 with the Cuban Revolution. How dare you make a revolution in our backyard? And so they've never forgiven the Cuban people, and that's the real purpose of the blockade. The purpose of the blockade and the embargo is to make life as difficult as possible for the Cuban people, with the hope that the Cuban people will rise up and overthrow their revolution. That's the purpose. So there is material deprivation in Cuba, and Washington loves to point to it as an example of a failed revolution. But the Cuban people have not done what Washington has desired, and for that reason, that's why the Obama administration decided to float the idea of maybe bringing about changes in U.S. foreign policy. The change was really about how to overthrow the revolution. If we couldn't overthrow it by starving the revolution to death, maybe we should have exactly. And that's what the Obama initiative was about. And that initiative, as you know, is now on hold. It hasn't gone anywhere. And one can speculate about what will happen in the future with it. But the main thing is that the Cubans understand what they're facing, what Washington is about. And the Cubans are prepared to defend their revolution. They've gone through very difficult periods before in their history, especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1999. They lost half of their economy, but they hung in, defended themselves, and proved stronger coming out of it. And they look back at that experience, by the way, as in looking at the new hardships they face with the pandemic, because just as this pandemic is facing working people throughout the world in a very, very difficult way, harsh way, it's also affecting the Cuban people. But the Cuban people use the experience of going through very difficult times in the past and coming together and expressing solidarity, not only with each other on the island, but solidarity with people elsewhere in the world. This is how they see they will be able to cope with this new challenge that they are grappling with. So yes, there are difficulties that the Cubans face. They are trying to grapple with them and so on. And this pandemic doesn't make it easier. But we're all in the same boat in terms of in this moment, in terms of the oppressed, in terms of the working class and so on. We find ourselves in a situation that is similar. And here in the United States, of course, the impact of this and the differential impact of, as you've already noted, within working class communities of colors and so on. The unemployment figures that came out on Friday with the Latino unemployment rate now at 18, that's officially. Remember, many Latinos who don't have papers, people who don't have citizenship papers, they can't apply for unemployment insurance. Right. And so this is really having a very, very negative impact on those layers of the population.
Let's talk about other parts of the Afro-Latino world. I monitor things going on in Venezuela from time to time, have a check-in with the Afro-Peruvian and Colombian communities. And I think you know, he's a friend of yours, an acquaintance of mine, only on Facebook, brother Jesus Chucho Garcia. And he was in a panel recently talking about the COVID impact in Venezuela. But Venezuela in general is in a state of flux, as are most of the countries in Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, etc. What's the sense of the experience of the Afro-descendientes, the emergence of African culture, and the growth, protection, the articulation of African identity in the Spanish world, from your point of view? How does Cuba play into that? And how does that development of consciousness, awareness of language, at some point in time connect with our experience here in North America?
I think it's safe to say that with the coming of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the African heritage in the Americas was given an emphasis that it had never been given before. The recognition of it, the recognition of the African influence. And it was in one of his first speeches, in fact, in 1959, that Castro was in three months after the triumph of the revolution, which Castro gave a famous speech in which he said that all of us have roots in Africa in one way or another. And that was new, that was refreshing for the peoples of the Americas, especially the people of African descent within the Americas. And more concretely, it's when Cuba began sending troops to fight in Africa, when Che Guevara went to the Congo in 1965 to try to help lead the liberation movement within the Congo. So it wasn't just talking about our African heritage, but it was also doing something about it, sending troops to actually fight in Africa to free Africa from colonial in post-colonial oppression. And so what it did, and I remember my first trip to Cuba was in 1983, and I met some young Black Cubans, and boy, there was this sense of pride about being Black in Cuba, mm-hmm. and especially because of what Cuba had been able to do in Africa. Mm-hmm. And so I think, yeah, I know of no other examples of that within the Americas. In my first trip to Santiago de Cuba in 1990, I had a kind of a shock. I must admit, I saw something I had never seen before. I was on one of the main streets in Santiago, one of the main avenues in Santiago de Cuba, and lo and behold, as I'm walking, and I see a bunch of statues lining the streets and so on. And as I got close to the statues, I realized that these were generals, famous generals. It must have been about maybe a third of them or half of them were Black, mm-hmm. were Black Cubans. Mm-hmm. People like, I didn't know the Moncada barracks after where the attack took right. place in 1953. Moncada was a Black Cuban. Mm-hmm. And there were many others. And of course, the biggest monument in Santiago is that dedicated to Antonio Maceo. And so there's this sense of pride within Cuba. By the way, I always take this opportunity in Minnesota to point out that in 1898, when Maceo was killed in battle, the Black community in St. Paul, Minnesota, staged an opera dedicated to Maceo. And really? if ever you wanted to know why a name became popular in the Black community for boys, we pronounce it Maceo. Right. It was inspired by the example. We didn't have, in 1898, we didn't have many heroes mm-hmm. Here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And Maceo was a hero for African Americans. So yes, this was a development that transcends just Cuba, but you see it throughout the Americas. And with the coming of the revolution, that process simply deepened. And the connections with African religions. When Fidel Castro invited the head of the Yoruba religion, to come to Cuba to speak in 1996, that was before the Pope. Mm-hmm. People forget that before the Pope got to Cuba, the head of the African religion, Yoruba religion, was invited to speak in Cuba. So that's another important connection. So yes, getting back to your question about what Chucho and others are doing, Chucho and others look to the Cuban example. It's exactly what the Cubans have been able to do to deepen the ties with Africa. That serves as a pole of attraction to inspire people of African descent in Venezuela and other parts of Latin America to do the same.
And so what happens when we begin to sort of recognize that we're not here alone? Somehow we are raised to believe that my world is North Minneapolis or South Minneapolis, or maybe it's Minnesota and Chicago, or maybe it's New York or the West Coast. But somehow we see ourselves, we encourage to be both parochial and limited in our view of who we are. Our identity system is exclusive, not inclusive of the reality that we're part of a network, a movement, a wave, a global transfer of humanity, right? Of Africans from the continent to North and South America. We don't recognize that there are more people of African descent in Brazil, for example, than in the United States, and that our population is simply part of a phenomenally large contingent of Africans in the Americas. If we begin to realize that, what could emerge from that? What can we co-create with other people with similar and some, at the same time, dissimilar experiences, but a common experience that we all can talk to and agree that that's why we're here? What could we do in your mind, in your thought, August Nimtz?
Well, it's a big question now, and it's one that plays itself out in all kinds of ways. And thinking about the question and my own personal experience, I'm fortunate to have grown up in a city New Orleans, and we sometimes say New Orleans is the most northern city in the Caribbean. And so growing up in a place like New Orleans, I was always aware of the connections to the Caribbean and other countries. And for me, as an African American, I know it was a tremendous value because I no longer saw myself as a minority. I was part of something larger. And so that kind of consciousness of seeing yourself as something, being a part of a larger reality, is of tremendous value in doing the kinds of things that we hope we'll be able to do in the future in terms of liberating ourselves. But awareness, you're right. Awareness that you're part of something, you're not alone, you're part of a larger movement. And it's a historical movement. It has its ups and downs, that movement. My generation, we benefited tremendously from the example of Malcolm X, because Malcolm, for my generation, perhaps more than any other, helped us to make the connections, to see ourselves as a part of something larger. And I think whenever the lessons of that period, I think, is our movement is stronger when we see ourselves as a part of something, as a part of something larger. And our movement perhaps may not be as strong today as it once was, exactly because of that. But it has its ups and downs. And this will happen. This pandemic, by the way, is helping us to see ourselves. I always like to remind people that the word pandemic means all of the people, literally. That's what it means. That's the root of the word. The pan and the demic, from the word democracy, all of the people. And so right now, Mother Nature is teaching us that borders are unimportant. National borders are unimportant.
Artificial.
Yeah, they will. The borders will get in the way. The borders will get in the way. National borders will get in the way in trying to solve this problem.
We're out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation, Professor August Nimtz. Always great to see you and great to listen to you. I thank you for your leadership, your service, your vision, and your scholarship. And thank you for all the work that you and your colleagues do with the Minnesota-Cuba Committee.
Thanks very much.
Connect and join and support. How do they reach out to connect to the Minnesota-Cuba Committee?
Yes, just go online and you'll find we have a dated webpage, which we have to update, but we're on Facebook, the Minnesota-Cuba Committee, and also on the internet, MinnesotaCubaCommittee.org, all one word, MinnesotaCubaCommittee.org, and you can find out about us. And thanks again for inviting us out.
Thank you so much. I'm Al McFarlane. Join me again this time next week for another edition of Conversations with Al McFarlane. Stay tuned for Lady J. Great music right here on KFAI. We'll see you back to the studio.
Thank you so much, Al McFarlane and August Nimtz.